The tide brought him in like driftwood, and the old man on the beach did not run. Joaquim Mendez had been mending nets since before the suns of two empires rose over this coastline, and he had seen drowned sailors and drowned saints, and once, when he was a boy, a whale with a harpoon in its eye that wept fresh water until it died. He had buried all of them with the same two hands. So when the long, pale shape rolled up out of the surf at dawn, wearing a suit that was not cloth and a ring that pulsed like a slow heart, Joachim only Fenny set down his net, walked into the foam to his knees, looked. The creature opened its eyes. They were not eyes, they were two small windows into a colder sea than the one behind him. "You are early," Joachim said in Portuguese, because that was the language he prayed in. "Or you are late. I cannot tell which." The thing on the sand did not answer in words. It lifted its hand, and the ring on its finger turned, and the morning bent. The wind reversed. A gull hung suspended in the act of opening its wings. A wave that had been falling began instead to climb. Joachim felt his own breath try to crawl backward into his lungs, and he understood, with the simple animal certainty of a man who has lived a long time near deep water, that this thing on the sand owned something that did not belong to it. He waded forward anyway. He took the creature under the arms, the way he had taken his wife under the arms in her last week, and he dragged it up, onto dry sand where the crabs would not have it. "Whatever you are," he said, "the sun will burn you." Come, this is the part the historians, later, when there were still historians, underline with red ink. The first contact between humanity and the Odori was not a war room. It was not a flag. It was a man with arthritis in both knees pulling a god out of the water because the god would otherwise have died of the sunrise. His name, the creature would eventually offer, was something a human throat could not make. So Joachim called him Odara, because that was a word from the old religion of the coast, and it meant good thing, beautiful thing, blessing. It was a joke, mostly. Joachim had a sense of humor that had outlived 3 children and a wife, and was by now mostly callous. Odara learned the joke and kept the name. He stayed for 61 days in the fisherman's house above the dunes. He learned to drink coffee and pretended to like it. He learned the names of the 7 kinds of fish in the bay, and the names of Joachim's dead, and the song Joachim's mother had sung to him about a moon that fell in love with a clay pot. He did not eat. He watched. The ring on his finger turned sometimes in his sleep, and on those nights the candle in the kitchen burned down, and then unburned itself, and the moths on the windowsill returned to being eggs. He learned to sit on the porch in the evenings. That was Joachim's hour. The old man would carry out a flask of cane spirit and 2 clay cups, and he would pour one for himself and one for Odara, and Odara would not drink. He would lift the cup when Joachim lifted his, because he had observed that the lifting was the thing that mattered. They watched the sun go down over the water. They did not speak most evenings. Some evenings Joachim told stories about his wife, about the storm of '04, about a priest who had tried to convert a parrot, and Odara listened with his head slightly tilted, the way certain birds listen, and when Joachim laughed at his own jokes, Odara made a sound that was not laughter but was, perhaps, the nearest thing his throat could shape to it. On the 28th night, a storm came in off the Atlantic. It was the kind of storm that opens the roofs of poor houses and takes the children of careless mothers. Joachim's roof was not poor, but it was old. The rain came through in 3 places, and Joachim climbed up onto the rafters in the dark with a hammer and a fistful of palm thatch to do what he could. Odara stood in the kitchen below and watched. After a while, without saying anything, he lifted his hand and turned the ring, and the rain that had come through the roof was no longer on the floor. It was back outside in the air, where rain belongs. Joachim, on the rafters, paused with his hammer halfway raised. He looked down. He looked at Odara. He said, "Thank you," in the careful voice he used for guests, and he went back to nailing thatch, because the roof would still need fixing in the morning, ring or no ring. That was the night Joachim began to understand what was sitting in his kitchen. It was also the night he began to understand that he was not afraid of it. He was 81 years old and had buried 3 children, and there are things a man stops being afraid of after a certain weight of grief. A strange visitor with a strange ring was, in the end, just another guest who would eventually leave. What Joachim did not yet understand was that Odara, for his part, had begun to be afraid. Not of the storm. Not of the human. Of the slow, soft something that was happening to him in this house. The Odorai had a word for it that did not translate. It meant, roughly, the sickness of small places. It was what happened to a scout who stayed too long in one frame of reference and began to forget the larger one. It was why scouts were rotated. It was why 61 days was, by the protocols of the Council of Tending, the absolute maximum a cartographer was permitted to spend in any single century before reporting back. Odara was that night, on day 28. He had 33 days left. He had begun to look forward to the evening hour on the porch. He had begun, when Joachim sang the song about the moon and the clay pot, to want the song to continue past the verse where Joachim always stopped. The 62nd morning, Odara walked into the sea and did not come back. Joachim sat on the porch for 3 days, and on the 4th he went back to his nets. He told no one. Who would have believed him? He was 81 years old and lived alone, and the priest had stopped visiting after Joachim told him that God, if he existed, was probably a fish. That was the year 1612. Joachim died in his sleep 4 winters later, and the house above the dunes fell down, and the bay forgot. The Odorai did not. They came back in the year humans would call 2387, and they did not come as one drowned scholar with a curious ring. They came as a fleet. They came in numbers that bent the math of the outer system. Ships that were not ships but something closer to weather. And they did not announce themselves because, from their point of view, no announcement was necessary. They had been here before. They had filed the paperwork. The paperwork said, "This planet is a garden, and gardens are tended." The first thing they did was take the moon. Destroy it. Take it. The ring tech that Odara had carried, the slow heart that bent time at the edges, had grown in 4 centuries into something that could fold whole bodies of matter out of the present tense. The moon did not explode. It simply was not there anymore. The tides on Earth went mad inside an hour. Boats that had been at anchor were on dry mud by noon. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years on river deltas were knee-deep in salt by sundown. The Odorai broadcast on every frequency humanity used. Few humanity didn't know it used. And the message was not a threat. That was the thing that broke people. It wasn't a threat. It was an apology. We regret, the message said. In 4,114 human languages, including 3 that were extinct and 1 that had not yet been invented, the necessity of this correction. The garden has grown wild. We will tend it now. Please do not be alarmed. Your dead will be returned to you when the work is finished. People argued, later, about what that last sentence meant. Most of them did not get the chance to argue for long. In the harbor town of Salinas do Sul, on the same coast where a fisherman had once dragged a god out of the surf, a woman named Inés Méndez Caro stood on the seawall and watched the water go out. She was 63 years old. She had been the harbor master for 22 of those years, and the assistant harbor master for 12 before that, and she knew the bay the way a pianist knows a keyboard. The water was going out wrong. It was going out the way water goes down a drain, not the way a tide ebbs. There was a hole in the sea somewhere, and the sea was finding it. Her radio was screaming in 4 languages. Her daughter, in Lisbon, was not answering. Her granddaughter, who lived with her, was upstairs in the lighthouse keeper's old apartment, sleeping off a night shift at the clinic. Inés considered for one clean second, simply sitting down on the seawall and letting the world end without her. Then she went up the stairs and woke the girl. "Mira," she said, "get the bag, the one by the door. We are leaving." Mira was 29 and had her grandmother's mouth, which was a mouth that had said no to a great many things in its life and meant it. Avo, what's happened? Bag, door now. They were 3 kilometers inland on the ridge road when the wave came back. It came back the way an animal comes back to a thing it has dropped. It took Salinas do Sul off the map between one breath and the next. Inés watched it in the side mirror of the truck and did not stop driving. "Where are we going?" Mira said. "Up," Inés said, "and we'll see." They saw eventually. Everyone did. The Odorai descended in landing craft that looked like nothing and weighed less. They came down on every continent at once. They were tall, gray, beautiful in the way. Certain insects are beautiful, and they moved through human cities the way a careful gardener moves through a flower bed, stepping over some things, plucking others. occasionally crouching to examine a specimen with an expression that was very nearly tender. They did not kill at random. That would have been wasteful. They had categories, they had a list. The list had been compiled, apparently, by Odara himself, 475 years earlier during 61 days in a fisherman's house. He had been a scout. He had been taking notes. The notes were thorough. Humans who had skills useful to the tending of the garden were taken aboard the great floating weather ships and put to work. Humans who had skills useful to nothing were left where they fell. Humans who fought back were turned, by a flick of the ring tech, into something that was not quite stone and not quite glass and was. The Odorai assured the survivors, painless. The fields outside what had been Mumbai filled up with these statues, the plazas of what had been Sao Paulo, the square in front of what had been the Kremlin. They caught the light in ways that suggested the people inside them were still, in some sense, looking out. By the end of the first year, 3 billion humans were dead, and the Odorai considered the correction to be proceeding on schedule. This is where the story would end in most tellings. A garden tended, a species pruned, a long quiet broken, only by the sound of careful gray hands lifting the next specimen for inspection. There was Ines Mendes Caro on a ridge above a drowned coast, and there was her granddaughter. And there was a thing Ines had not told anyone in 63 years, because her grandmother had told it to her once, and made her swear. There was a name, there was a song, there was in a wooden box buried under the floor of a house that no longer existed, a ring. It had been her great-great-great-grandfather's, the fisherman's, the one who had pulled the drowned god out of the surf. He had taken it off the creature's finger on the 59th night, when Odara slept the strange, flickering sleep that was not sleep, and he had put it in a box and buried the box under the Kidditchin floor and never spoken of it. He had been a quiet man. He had reasoned, perhaps, that a being who could unburn a candle should not be allowed to leave with all of his tools. Odara had noticed on the 62nd morning. Joachim had watched him notice. Odara had stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the place under the floor where the ring was, and then he had looked at Joachim, and Joachim had looked back, and neither of them had said anything. Then Odara had walked into the sea. The box had been moved over the centuries, from house to house, from hand to hand, with the family. It had crossed the ocean once and come back. It had been buried under 3 different floors. The story, by the time it reached Ines at her grandmother's knee, had become almost a joke. Family curse. The ugly ring nobody could sell because nobody could open the box, and nobody could open the box because the box was older than locks. Ines had inherited the box at 31. She had spent 6 months trying to open it and failed. She had put it in a strong box in the harbor master's office at Salinas do Sul, behind a panel marked obsolete tide tables, and she had forgotten about it for 32 years. The harbor master's office, on the morning the moon went away, was under 9 meters of salt water. "We have to go back," Ines said. Mira had been a nurse for 7 years. She had seen people say impossible things in the hour after disaster. She did not argue. She said, "Tell me why." Ines told her, the whole thing, the drowned god, the fisherman, the box, the ring. By the time she finished, the truck was idling on a forest track above a river that had 6 hours ago been a city. "Avo," Mira said very gently. "That's a fairy tale." "Yes," Ines said. "And there is a fleet of fairy tale monsters taking the moon so." Mira looked at her grandmother. Grandmother looked back. They had the same mouth. "How deep is the office?" Mira said. Took them 11 days to get back to where Salinas do Sul had been. They walked the last 40 kilometers because the truck ran out of fuel and there was no more fuel to be had anywhere on the coast. They ate what they could find. Mira shot a dog on the 4th day, and they ate that. Neither of them spoke of it afterward. The bay was unrecognizable. The seawall was gone. The lighthouse was a stump. The harbor master's office, by Ines's calculation, was now somewhere under a long flat shallow that had been, until recently, the main square. 3. Odorai walked through that shallow as Ines watched from the tree line. They were measuring something. Their long gray arms dipped into the water and came up holding small, bright objects, which they examined and then dropped. Cataloging, sorting, tending the garden. Mira had been a competitive freediver in her 20s. She had stopped because of an ear infection that never quite healed. and because her grandmother had asked her to. She had not been under more than 3 meters in 9 years. "How long can you hold it now?" Ines asked. 2 minutes, Mira said. "Maybe 2.5 if I don't panic. You'll have to not panic." "Yes, Avo. I had worked that out." They waited until the Odorai moved up the shore. Then Mira stripped to her undershirt and her trousers, and Ines kissed her, on both cheeks, the way her own grandmother had kissed her, and Mira walked into the water that had been the square of Salinas dos Sul, and did not come up for 1 minute and 40 seconds. When she came up, she was holding the strongbox. It had been 40 years since the door of that strongbox had been opened, and the key was at the bottom of the sea inside the pocket of a man named Hector who had been the deputy harbor master. Ines had a small pry bar in the bag. They went into the trees. The strongbox opened on the 7th try, with a sound like a small animal being killed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a wooden box older than any of them, and inside the box, on a piece of red felt that had once been a piece of a fisherman's wife's wedding dress, was a ring. It did not pulse, it did not glow, was a plain gray band, slightly tarnished, with a stone that might have been any stone. "That's it," Mira said. "That's it." "And it does what?" "Bends time," Ines said. "Allegedly." Mira looked at the ring. Then she looked at her grandmother. Then she laughed just once. A short, hard sound that was not really a laugh. "Avo," she said, "we are going to die out here." "Probably," Ines said. "But not today. Put it on." "Why me?" "Because I am 63 and my hands shake, and I want a steady hand on this if it works." Or put the ring on the 3rd finger of her right hand. It fit. It did not pulse. It did not glow. Nothing happened for a long time. Mirza sat on a log and breathed. Ines sat on the ground and watched the Odorai down by the shallows. The smaller one had crouched and was lifting something out of the water with great gentleness, as though it were a butterfly that had drowned. "I don't feel anything," Mira said. "Try wanting something." "Like what?" "Try wanting yesterday." Mira closed her eyes. She thought of the clinic in Salinas de Sul, of the morning shift, of the smell of coffee, in the break room and the old radio that played the wrong station because nobody could fix the tuner. She thought of her grandmother 3 days ago, in the kitchen, complaining about the price of onions. She wanted yesterday so hard her teeth ached. The leaves above her stopped moving. A bird that had been mid-call held the note. A gnat in front of her face hung in the air like a small black bead. Ines, sitting on the ground 6 meters away, was a statue with her mouth half open. Mira's heart was the only sound in the world. She held the moment for as long as she could bear it, and then she let it go, and the leaves moved, and the bird finished its call, and Ines said, "Well?" "It works," Mira said. Her voice was very small. Ines nodded once, then she said, "Now we have a problem." "Why?" "Because if we have it," Ines said, "they have noticed." She was right. Down by the shallows, all 3 Odorai had turned in their direction. Even at this distance, even through the trees, Mira could feel the precise attention of them, like 3 rifle scopes finding her at once. "Run," Ines said. They ran. For 6 weeks they ran. They ran up into the highlands, and through the dead farms, and across a bridge that had been condemned in 2104, and was still standing out of pure spite. They ran past statues of people they had known. They ran past a field where every cow had been turned to glass and stood there shining in the sun. They ran until Ines's knees gave out, and then Mira carried her. And then a man named Bento with a truck and a shotgun and one good eye found them on a back road and drove them another 300 kilometers before the truck died too. Bento joined them. So did a woman named Ayana, who had walked across what had been 3 countries with her 2 children, and a boy named Pedro who had stopped speaking, and a girl named Lua who had not stopped speaking once in 12 days. So did an old soldier named Krish, who had retired before the moon went away, and now wore his uniform again because he had nothing else clean. By the time they reached the mountains in the south, there were 19 of them. They moved at night, mostly. The Odorai did not patrol heavily in the highlands. There was nothing in the highlands worth tending. But they had drones that did not look like drones, things that drifted across the sky like jellyfish and lit up sometimes for no reason anyone could explain. The group learned to read the drones. They learned that the drones were lazy, in the way old security systems are lazy, and that if you waited under cover for the count of 140, the drone would lose interest and drift on. Krish, who had spent 26 years in armies of one kind or another, taught the count to the children. He made a game of it. The girl, Lua, got very good. She had a flat, unemotional voice for the numbers and a face that gave nothing away. And Krish told her once, in private, that she would have been an excellent sniper. And she said, very seriously, I know. They came down through the foothills, in the third week of the journey, into a long valley that had been, before the moon went, a vineyard. The vines were still there. The grapes were still on the vines, half mummified, sweet as honey and dark as old blood. They ate them by the handful. Lua got sick from too many and threw up behind a wall, and Ayana held her hair. And the boy Pedro watched without speaking, the way he watched everything. Pedro had not spoken since the day the Odorai had through his village. He was 12. He carried a small wooden horse in his pocket. He took it out sometimes at night and held it and put it back. In the fourth week, they found a farmhouse with a working radio. It was a crystal set of all things, a thing a boy had built from a kit in 2089 and his grandson had kept in a drawer, and it picked up, very faintly, on a frequency the Odorai did not bother to monitor, a human voice. The voice was speaking from somewhere on the other side of the world. It was speaking in Old Tamil. None of them spoke Tamil. But the voice was steady, and it kept going. And when it stopped, it started again from the beginning. And that meant a person, somewhere, was alive and reading aloud, and that meant Salinas do Sul was not the only place that had once existed. They sat around the radio for 2 hours. They did not understand a word. Ines cried, just once, very quietly, with her hand pressed against her mouth, and then she stopped. All right, she said when she was finished. Right. They moved on in the morning. Mira practiced with the ring every night. She learned slowly what it would do. It would not unmake the moon. It would not bring back the drowned. It would, in a small bubble around her body, slow time to almost nothing, almost a minute, before something inside her chest began to scream. It would, with more effort and more pain, push time backward by a few seconds. In the same small bubble, she could undo a fall. She could undo a bullet, if she saw it coming. She could not undo a city. She watched her practice on the 14th night and said, It's a knife. They have a sword. You understand that? Yes, Mira said. Then what are we doing? We're getting close enough to use the knife. Krish thought about this for a while. Then he said, Good answer. The plan, when it came together, was Ines's. It was a fisherman's plan. It was the kind of plan a woman who has spent 40 years watching tides comes up with, which is to say, it was patient and cold, and based on the assumption that the sea will eventually give you what you want if you are willing to wait in the right place. The Odorai had a flagship. Everyone knew this by now. The broadcasts came from it. It was the largest of the weather ships, and it hung in low orbit over what had been the Pacific. And it descended once a month to a landing ground in what had been Australia for what the Odorai called a council of tending. At that council, the leadership came down out of the ship. They walked briefly on the ground. They inspected the garden. They went back up. The leadership, the broadcast implied, included the eldest among them, the scout, the cartographer of Earth, one who had filed the original paperwork. Odara, he was still alive. Course he was. Time was a country to him, and he held the passport. We can't get into the ship, Krish said. We can't get within 20 kilometers of the landing ground. They scan for anything warm-blooded for 100 clicks out. I know, Ines said. Then what? We don't go to the ship, Ines said. We go to the beach. She meant the beach. The first beach. The one where the surf had brought him in, 476 years ago. Fishermen had waded out and dragged a god onto dry sand. The bay was still there. The sand was still there. The dunes were still there. Lower now, eaten by 4 centuries of weather. But there, he'll come back to it, Ines said. Sooner or later, they always do. The ones who live a long time, they go back to the first place. That's sentiment, Krish said. He doesn't have sentiment. He has something, Ines said. He stayed 61 days. He didn't have to. He stayed. You're betting our lives on the idea that an alien god is sentimental about a dead fisherman. Yes, Ines said. Krish looked at her for a long time. Then he laughed. The way old soldiers laugh when they recognize the shape of a thing. All right, he said. The beach. It took them 4 months to get back to the bay. They lost Ayana on the way. 2, a fever that 19th century medicine could have cured. And 24th century medicine could not, because they had no medicine. They lost the boy Pedro to a patrol of Odorai, who came through a valley at the wrong hour. They lost Bento to his own shotgun on a bad night in a barn. They were 13 when they reached the dunes. The bay had changed. The new tides, without a moon, were a slow, lazy thing that came in and out almost as an afterthought. The water was clearer than it had been in Inez's lifetime, because there were no boats and no factories, and no one to muddy it. The sand was very white. The dunes were lower, but they were the dunes. They dug in. They dug a hole in the dunes that was big enough for Mira to lie in flat, and they covered it with driftwood and sand, and the dry seagrass that grew there, and they put Mira in it. She would wait. She would wait as long as it took. They put a tube of bamboo so she could breathe, and they left her a skin of water and a strip of dried fish, and Inez kissed her on both cheeks again, and Krish saluted her, which was the first time he had saluted anyone in 9 years. The rest of them went up into the hills behind the bay, and they waited too. The wait was 41 days. Mira learned things, in those 41 days, that no human had ever learned before, because no human had ever had reason to. She learned how the sand changed temperature between noon and midnight. She learned that crabs would walk over a buried person's chest in the small hours, and that you could not flinch because the crabs were not the danger. The flinch was. She learned to piss where she lay and not care. She learned to count her own heartbeats up to 10,000 and then start again. She learned, on the 19th day, that her grandmother had been right about her. She did not panic. The panic came up sometimes, like a wave, and she let it come and she let it pass. She did not move. On the 34th day, an Odorai patrol walked across the beach not 5 meters from where she lay. She heard their long, careful footsteps in the sand. She heard one of them stop. She heard, through the bamboo tube, the sound of a gray hand sifting through dry seagrass. She held her breath for what felt like 100 years, and was probably 40 seconds. The hand moved on. The footsteps moved on. She did not breathe for another full minute after, just to be sure. That night she cried into the sand, silently, with her eyes open, because crying with the eyes closed would have wasted the moisture. Then she stopped, and she counted her heartbeats again, and she waited. On the 42nd morning, a landing craft came down out of a clear sky and settled on the sand without sound. 3 Odorai stepped out. One of them was older than the others. Tell, because his suit was a different color, and because the younger ones moved around him, with a particular careful posture, the way humans move around a very old grandfather. The old one walked down to the waterline. He stood there for a long time. 2 younger ones waited by the craft. Mira, under the sand, could not see this. She could only listen. She heard the surf. She heard footsteps. She heard the old one stop and breathe. They did breathe, the Odorai, though not for the same reason humans did, and stand very still. She heard him say, in Portuguese, in the voice of an old man who has not used a language for a long time, Joaquim? That was the moment Inez had bet everything on. The moment of sentiment. The moment a god came back to the first beach and tried, just once, to call out to the only friend he had ever made on this planet, 476 years dead. Mira surged up out of the sand. She had practiced this. She had practiced it for months. She came up clean, the driftwood scattering, the sand falling off her in sheets, and she was inside the bubble before the 2 younger Odorai had finished turning their heads. Time slowed to almost nothing around her. The surf hung. The gulls hung. The 2 younger ones were statues with their hands halfway to whatever weapon they carried inside their suits. Odara was not a statue. Adara had a ring too. Odara's ring was older and his control was better, and inside the bubble of her stopped time, he turned, slowly, but he turned, and he looked at her. He was beautiful the way Joaquim had said in the family stories. He was terrible. His eyes were 2 small windows into a colder sea than the one behind him. Mira had a knife in her left hand and the ring on her right. She did not use the knife. The knife had been Krish's idea, and she had taken it to make him feel better, but she had known, all along, that the knife was not the point. She walked up to Odara, inside the bubble, with the surf hanging behind her, and she held up her right hand. She showed him the ring. His ring. The one Joaquim had taken on the 59th night and buried under the kitchen floor. Odara looked at the ring. Then he looked at her face. Then he looked at the ring again. Then, slowly, Against the resistance of her stop time, he raised his own hand and showed her his own ring, and she saw, for the first time, that there was a small chip out of the stone, on the underside, where it had hit the corner of a wooden box 476 years ago. Matched pair. Of course. They had always been a pair. He had carried one. The scout always carried one. The other was kept by the council and given back to him on his return. He had been looking this whole time. 4 centuries of searching. The garden had grown wild because the gardener had lost a tool, and he could not rest until he found it. And here it was. On the finger of a granddaughter, of a fisherman, on the same beach. He said something to her in his own language. It was a long, soft sound like wind in a chimney. She did not understand it. She thought later that it had probably been thank you. Then he reached out his hand for the ring. This was the moment. This was the moment Ines had spent 4 months walking toward. This was the moment Krish had spent 14 nights teaching Mira to recognize. The moment the gardener reached for his tool. Had 3 seconds inside the bubble. She had practiced. She knew exactly what she was going to do. She did not give him the ring. She took his hand instead. The way her great-great-great-grandfather had taken his hand under the arms in the surf. And she did the thing she had practiced for 14 nights and never quite managed. She pushed both rings, his and hers, hard, against each other, and she pushed time backward. Not 3 seconds. Not 5. 476 years. The bubble blew out around her like a soap film, and Odora was gone, and the 2 younger Odorai were gone, and the landing craft was gone, and the sky above the bay was a sky from a different century. The sand was wetter. The dunes were higher. There was a small house up on the bluff with a thatched roof and smoke coming out of the chimney. Mira stood on the beach alone, and she was shaking, and she was bleeding from the nose and from one ear, and the ring on her finger was cracked clean through. She walked up the beach. The man on the porch was small and brown and old, and he was mending a net. He looked up when she came over the dune, and his face did the thing old faces do when something has surprised them. Past the point of surprising, he set down the net. "Senora," he said, "you are not from here." "No," she said, "Senor Mendez, Joaquim, I have come a long way to ask you for a favor." She told him everything. Fleet, the moon, the garden, the fisherman who would, in 61 days, drag a god out of the surf, the ring under the kitchen floor, the 4 centuries. The granddaughter who would eventually come back. All of it. She talked until the sun went down. Joaquim Mendez listened without interrupting. He was a man who had buried 3 children and a wife, and was, by now, mostly callous. When she finished, he sat for a while. Then he said, "So you want me to not pull him out of the water?" "Yes, let him die there. Yes, he is a person. You are asking me to let a person die." "He is not a person, Senhor. He is a scout. He is the front of a knife." Kim thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "And if I don't pull him out, your fleet never comes. My fleet never comes. My grandmother never chews. My city never drowns. My boy Pedro, he was 12, he gets to grow up." Her voice broke on the boy's name. "Senhor. I have walked across 2 countries to ask you this, please." Joaquim looked out at the sea for a while. The light was going. A gull went over. "I have buried everything I love," he said finally. "I am 81 years old. The priest does not visit me anymore. I told him God was a fish." "Yes," Mira said. "She told me that story, my grandmother, about the priest." Joaquim smiled, just barely. Then she remembered, he said. "Good." He stood up. His knees made a sound. He looked at her, and there was something in his face Mira would think about for the rest of her life. It was not pity. It was not kindness. It was the look of a man who has just been handed in his last winter the chance to do one final useful thing. "Senhora," he said, "go home. Your grandmother is waiting." "I can't go home, Senhor. The ring is broken." He looked down at her hand. He looked at the cracked stone. Then he looked at her face again. "Then stay," he said. "I have a guest room. It is small. The roof leaks. Tomorrow we will fix the roof." Mira began, very quietly, to cry. In the morning she sat on the porch and watched Joaquim walk down to the beach with his nets. The tide was coming in. She knew what time it was. She knew to the minute when the long pale shape would roll up out of the surf. Joaquim walked along the waterline. He saw the shape. He stopped. He looked at it for a long time, in the way a man looks at something he has been told about by a traveler. Then he turned. He picked up his nets. He walked back up the beach, past Mira on the porch, and he did not look at her, and she did not look at him. The gulls cried, and the tide came in, and the long pale shape on the sand did not move, and the sun rose higher, and the long pale shape on the sand did not move, and by noon the long pale shape on the sand was very still indeed. Joachim came up the porch steps. He sat down beside Mira. He took her hand. "It's done," he said. "Yes." "Was he in pain?" "I don't know, Senhor. I don't think they feel it the way we do." They sat for a long time. "I will not see your world," Joachim said eventually. "I will not know if it worked." "No, Senhor, but you will." "Yes." "Then tell me, Senhora, in your time, when the sea is quiet, tell me how it goes." Mira squeezed his hand. She could not speak. She stayed on the coast for the rest of her life. She married a fisherman's son in 1614 and bore 3 children of her own, and she taught the eldest, a girl, a songs about a moon that fell in love with a clay pot, and she made the girl swear to teach it to her daughter, and her daughter, and her daughter, down the long line, all the way down to a harbor master in a town called Salinas de Sul who would, in another 4 centuries, wake her granddaughter in the dark and say, "Get the bag, we are leaving." That granddaughter would never be born. That harbor master would never be born. The moon would never be taken. The bay would not drown. But the song would still be sung, somewhere, by somebody, because Mira had carried it back 476 years and planted it in a house on a bluff, and songs, once planted, are very hard to kill. The Odorai never came again. They sent other scouts to other worlds, and they tended other gardens, and a few of them, in the long, quiet centuries that followed, wondered idly what had happened to the scout they sent to that small blue planet in the spiral arm, the one who never came back, the one whose ring was never recovered. They marked the world unreachable on their charts, and they moved on. On Earth, no one knew. No one ever knew. Joaquim Mendes was buried under a fig tree in 1616 beside his wife, and his stone said only his name and the dates. And there was nothing on the stone about the morning he walked past a dying god in the surf and did not stop, because a traveler from another century had asked him not to. His great-granddaughter, 8 generations down, taught her own daughter the song about the moon and the clay pot, and, on certain nights, when the tide was very low and the bay was very quiet, that daughter would walk down to the waterline and look out and feel, without knowing why, that something enormous had once almost happened here, and had not, and that she should be grateful, without knowing for what. She would walk back up the dunes. She would go inside. She would close the door. The bay would keep its secret. The garden, untended, would grow wild and beautiful, and the wildness would be the point, and the beauty would be the point, and no one, not one human soul, in all the long crowded centuries that followed, would ever know what they had been spared, or by whom, or at what cost. Which is in the end the most human kind of victory there is.